Hello, I'm Solveig Hanson, lead researcher for the Canadian Organic Vegetable Improvement Project. And today I'm excited to share what this season's Radicchio trials have showed us about early red Radicchio varieties. I will speak this presentation in English. The slides are bilingual, English and French. They are not perfectly translated, I bet. So please forgive me if there's a less than ideal translation on the slide. Okay, the goal of this trial was to trial early maturing red Radicchio varieties in organic conditions, particularly in the Prairies and Ontario regions. There were 3 core varieties that everybody trialed, and then 3 optional varieties. People planted 16 plants per variety, and 18 participants evaluated varieties using the seedling DAP, where they submitted 1 through 5 ratings for traits like germination, vigor, appearance, and yield. So, looking at my Radicchio colored pointer, the core varieties were 2 open pollinated Chioggia types, which is the ball type Radicchio. It's the one it's the one markets are most familiar with here in North America, comparing 2 open pollinated varieties to 1 hybrid variety. And then growers could add on another hybrid variety, Leonardo, and also a Verona type, which is this kind of flattened football shape with this big striking white rib, and also a Treviso type, which is a tall shaped red variety. I will present trial results in a few different formats. Directly from SeedLinked, I will have pie charts showing the percentage of people who would grow the variety again. I'll also share photos that many of you took some really beautiful photos, so thank you for that, and comments. You gave some really insightful and substantive comments, so thank you for that. We'll also share links to the results in an email, so you can check out those photo and comment galleries for yourselves and look at the interactive results displays. I also did a statistical analysis on the results, which helps us understand how probable it is that a difference we see between trait ratings is real. So due to a real difference in the varieties rather than being an artifact of random variation. So I will walk through some of these bar charts and heat maps, but in general, the thing to remember is that the more stars, the more sure we are, or the more sure we can be that there's a real difference between the varieties. So after looking at this year's trial results, I will compare them with last year's nationwide Radicchio trials and add some insights from a really cool raw versus cooked tasting event that we held this early fall in Calgary, or near Calgary. So looking at who participated, the purple dots here and here are the Radicchio trial participants. These trials were coordinated by Tiara and Rebecca, the Bauta Initiative regional coordinators from the Prairies and Ontario regions, respectively. So because they were the coordinators, Alberta and Ontario had the majority of participants, with a few more folks from BC and Quebec. Since there were only 18 participants, and because of the way they were distributed over hardiness zones, there wasn't a sensible way to look for environmental effects by hardiness zone. But just like our carrot trials this year, we did gain some insights by dividing participants into a Western group and an Eastern group. There were 9 participants in each of those regions, serendipitously. So looking at results by variety, the significance of difference is shown by this one lone star. So there's only one trait that showed a significant difference among varieties. This heat map shows green meaning a high rating, yellow meaning a mid-range rating, and red meaning a low rating. So the first thing you'll notice is there's a lot of green here. That means in general you liked these varieties. There was only one mean score down here for any trait variety combination that was below 3 or below acceptable. So we will talk about uniformity in more detail, since that's the one trait where we found a significant difference. The lack of significant effects here is for one of two reasons. One is that all of the varieties receive very similar scores. So something like germination, where everything just really did pretty well. And then there are cases like for yield, where there is a pretty substantial spread in yield, but there was a lot of variation within each variety. We'll talk a little bit more about that too. Looking at effects by region, only bolt resistance showed a fairly weak region effect. That very likely has to do with the differences in latitudes between the folks that are in those two regions. So even though the differences in average trait ratings between the regions are small, all of them except uniformity are higher in Eastern Canada. We also found no G by E. So there are no cases of varieties doing significantly worse or better in one environment than the other. With the caveat that our environmental variable, east versus west, is very broad, and there are certainly many environmental variables that we are not capturing. But this is what we can do with the data we have. Okay, so to look at some traits that varied among varieties, we'll start with uniformity, the one trait that varied significantly. So the significant difference in uniformity among varieties was driven by ratings from Eastern growers. So Vesuvio here was less uniform in the East. Was less uniform than TVG1 in the East, but not significantly different from any other variety in the East. And in the West, both Vesuvio and Sirio, which are the two open pollinated Chioggias, scored lower than other varieties, but not to a degree where we could have statistical confidence about that. We also see, when we look at yield, we can kind of visually see the difference in mean yield between regions. So yield is just overall a bit higher in the East than West. There are also some notable differences in yield between regions for a few varieties, which suggests a genotype by environment interaction. So for example, TVG1 was the highest yielding in the East, and it was the lowest yielding in the West. However, there was a really wide variation in trait ratings in both of those regions. So yield scores ranged from 1 to 5 in both regions. And so that's why we are not seeing statistical significance, even though there's a difference in means. There's less variation here when we look at appearance than for the other traits, but we can note that Pasqualino, that's the Verona type, the kind of squished football with the wide white ribs, it got high appearance scores in both the East and the West. There we go, East and West. TVG1 scored more highly in the East, but was more average in the West. And finally, flavor. The mean scores for flavor are almost identical between regions, but we do see some cases of difference by region. Leonardo was better liked than all the other varieties in the East, but it was about average in the West. Sirio was slightly better liked in the East. TVG struggled for flavor in the West, but it was pretty average in the East. So we can't be too confident about the repeatability of any of these differences. Like, so would we find this again if we did this trial again? We really can't be sure. But we can see trends that you can compare to your experience growing these varieties and maybe get some ideas for what you would like to try in the future. So this September, Tierra and Organic Alberta hosted a really awesome Radicchio themed field day at Poplar Bluff Organics near Calgary. There we did a tasting in which we tried 5 varieties of Radicchio, both raw and cooked, thanks to a local chef who did the cooking for us. That tasting included 4 of the varieties in this field trial. So the Indigo and Vesuvio Chioggias, plus Pasqualino, the Verona type, and TVG1, the Treviso type. So we saw a significant difference for all the traits here between raw and cooked samples for every trait. Appearance, texture, and overall flavor were like significantly more in the raw samples. Sweetness was perceived as higher in the raw samples, whereas bitterness was perceived as higher in the cooked samples. So people were generally liking uh, eating all of the varieties of Radicchio on average better raw. We also saw some variety by preparation effects for sweetness, overall flavor, and appearance, just meaning the same variety was perceived to have different flavor characteristics when it was cooked versus when it was raw. So the biggest one was for sweetness, and our TVG one was perceived as not very sweet at all when it was cooked, but quite sweet when it was raw. Vesuvio, you'll note, was rated quite sweet, both raw and cooked. Here's another example of variety by preparation interaction. So TVG1 was rated highest for overall flavor by a hair when raw, but lowest when cooked. So this is all to say, try whatever you're growing in a lot of different preparations and see how you like it. That might help inform how you recommend your customers to use it, and or talk to your customers, especially the chefs who might be very familiar with it already. So comparing to last year's CANOVI Radicchio trials, in 2021, we trialed Radicchio in sets corresponding to maturity time and market class. So all the varieties in the 2022 trial were split up into a couple of different sets last year. In this assorted set, we had Pasqualino and TVG1 alongside a few Castelfranco types and a De Lucia type to show there's some consistency between last year and this year. Pasqualino was rated significantly higher for marketability than some others last year, also rated as very marketable this year, and generally very well liked. Both of these varieties were pretty well liked. In our early red Radicchio set last year, all three of the varieties from this year's trial were included. The notable thing is that Vesuvio, the open pollinated Chioggia type, was competitive with the hybrid Chioggias for all traits, so not significantly different for any trait, which is the same in 2022. We generally saw that Vesuvio had slightly higher flavor ratings and slightly lower marketability and uniformity ratings. So to sum up, I will present a dossier of sorts for each variety to let you know what we've got on these Radicchio characters. I'll start with the Chioggias, and for all of them, none of them were significantly different than any other of them for any trait in 2022. For the three that were also trials in 2021, they were also not significantly different then. So I'm starting with Leonardo because it was the best liked overall in this year's trial. It seems to be very reliable and occasionally really great, from what I could see in comments and such. So participants are observing uniformity, tight heads over here, good flavor, both raw and cooked. For Indigo, the other hybrid, it's also generally reliable, but perhaps less remarkable. There's a little more variability that people were observing compared to Leonardo. So Karen's saying it's a good yield, even if some are smaller. Rosemary's noting some year-to-year variation, wondering whether this could be a profitable crop or something that's just going to be too variable to harvest reliably in a large enough quantity. Vesuvio, again, not significantly different for any trait than the hybrids. Really awesome sweet flavor, in my humble opinion. It was rated the highest for flavor, both raw and cooked, in our tasting up near Calgary. It was my personal favorite in last year's trials. You'll see that Christina agrees with me and Brenda does not. So, you know, flavor is very, perceived flavor varies a lot by the person and nobody's wrong. Cereal, we did not trial last year in 2021 because the seed was too late getting in to get out to you. Again, it was not significantly different for trait ratings, and it seems to be a reasonable option, especially for Western growers. So it was more bolt resistant in the West. It was better liked for flavor in the West. It showed greater vigor in the West than the East. In terms of uniformity in the West, the two open pollinated Chioggias scored lower than the variety, the hybrids, but not to a statistically significant degree. The comments show some noting of bolting, variability in head size and head tightness, but generally acceptable. Then there's Pasqualino, really a special little character. This is just a beautiful variety. The consensus seems to be that it's highly marketable. That's what we saw last year and this year. It was highest yielding in the West this year, second highest in the East. This comment is noting that it is giving about the same marketable yield as one of the best hybrid Chioggias. And of course, just striking appearance. So one to note. And then TVG1 was the better of the two early Treviso types trialed in 2021. Seems to be a good choice, especially for Eastern growers. There was good uniformity in both East and West, but higher flavor ratings and marketability ratings and yield ratings in the East than the West. So also really striking with the wide white ribs, and whether it fits on your farm depends on whether your consumers are open to playing around with an elongated Chioggia and one that may be less familiar to them. It's not an elongated Chioggia, it's an elongated Radicchio. With that, thank you so much for participating in these trials. If you are one of the participants, thank you for watching regardless. There will be a trial report soon for you to check out and read, along with links to the seedling data so you can peruse the interactive displays and photo galleries. Really appreciate your participation, your input of comments and photos, and all the time that you put into this. It's been a pleasure working with you all. Thanks.